Welcome to The Chemical Show, the podcast where chemical means business. I'm your host, Victoria Meyer, bringing you stories and insights from leaders driving innovation and growth across the chemical industry. Each week, we explore key trends, real-world challenges, and the strategies that make an impact. Let's get started. Welcome back to The Chemical Show. Today, I am speaking with Mark Plamondon, who is the Executive Director of the Alberta Industrial Heartland Association. You may remember that Mark is previously a guest on The Chemical Show, and we will link to that episode so that you've got access to that. And we're going to be talking about the wonderful world of Canada, and specifically Alberta and the Industrial Heartland, and just the benefits of investing in that region and more. So, Mark, thanks for joining me today.
Very nice to see you, Victoria, and thank you once again for having me on the show. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. So just provide, if you would, a brief overview to you and what your role is within the Heartland and also to the Heartland itself.
Glad to do so, for sure. So thanks for the introduction. Yeah, so I'm Mark Plamondon. I'm the Executive Director here at Alberta's Industrial Heartland Association. And our association, we represent municipalities, 5 municipalities, the City of Edmonton, the City of Fort Saskatchewan, Strathcona, Sturgeon, and Lamont counties. These all have land in an area called Alberta's Industrial Heartland, which sits in the northeast corner of the Edmonton region in Alberta. So just for those in the show, if you go to Alberta and then Edmonton, in the northeast corner of Edmonton, there's a 582 square kilometer heavy industrial cluster called Alberta's Industrial Heartland. And it is Canada's largest hydrocarbon processing region. We'll talk a little bit later about what the competitive advantages are and why companies are building projects here. But what we do, our association, we're funded by those municipalities, and we are focused in sort of 3 main areas. We're focused on promoting the region, so there's a huge marketing component, do a fair amount of international travel. We work with companies when they're assessing their next capital project. We want them to assess the Industrial Heartland and see if their next major capital project makes sense in Alberta's Industrial Heartland. Yeah. And we also have a significant effort in improving the region. So improving is either from a competitiveness standpoint, an infrastructure standpoint, a regulatory streamlining standpoint. This is all done through advocacy and partnerships with government and with other like-minded stakeholders. And then we also have somebody focused on, communications, social license, making sure that there's good dialogue between industry and community and that there's support for growth in the region. In a growing region, it's obviously very helpful if you have supportive community and strong social license, which we have here. So we spend a fair amount of time on that as well in partnership with the companies that operate here.
Yeah, and I think that's so critical. I think the role that you guys play is so critical because, of course, investment doesn't just happen. It happens with the support of the community, with the support of organizations such as yours, the municipality, and also other companies. I think it's so critical, the role that you play in that area.
Yeah, there's so many things that need to line up for a company to reach final investment decision. And so helping get roadblocks out of the way or streamline the process or just getting the information that they need to make a decision or partnering them with the right people to get their project moving forward, that's all part of the process here, and that's what we're doing here.
Awesome. I love it. So when we last spoke, Dow had just announced its FID for its net zero ethylene cracker in Fort Saskatchewan. And to the extent that you're able to, how is that progressing?
Yeah, so it was over a year ago, maybe 12 months ago or so, 13 months ago, I think, that Dow reached final investment decision for the world's first net zero ethylene manufacturing facility here in the Industrial Heartland, which was a very exciting announcement for our region because it's such a large project. And not only is it such a large project, it is, of course, that first net zero ethylene manufacturing facility that really puts Industrial Heartland on the map, I think, because, of course, Dow is a global company and they can put capital in a lot of places, and they have chosen to do this project here in Alberta's Industrial Heartland. I can't speak specifically to their project, of course, but just in general in the Industrial Heartland, there's been so much activity, and of course, the big project is the Dow project. We are seeing ramping up of traffic through the region. We are seeing workforces grow to meet the growing construction profile. Primarily at the Dow site, we'd expect, peak labor to be reaching here, but probably by the end of this year. But we're seeing growth at their site and then in a number of other areas as well when it comes to construction activities. Because since the Dow project reached FID, there's been a couple other final investment decisions which are in the public domain as well. Shell reached final investment decision on their Polaris project, which is a carbon capture project at the Shell Scotford site. I'll
That's
talk a little bit
excellent.
about the carbon sequestration capability in this region and why that's a competitive advantage for us here. And also, Shell, in partnership with ATCO EnPower, announced their Atlas project, which is a sequestration project. So both these projects were announced final investment decisions at the same time. So there's activities for that project as well. We're also seeing there's current construction activities in fractionation facilities. There's fractionation expansions in the region. So there's lots of activity. Like we're approaching a $50 billion, $45 to $50 billion of assets in the ground here now. And before the end of the decade, we'll be well over 60 billion in assets, 60 to 65 billion in assets probably, with growth in fractionation, of course, the net zero ethylene manufacturing. There's also, Linde has announced that they're building a $2 billion hydrogen facility on the Dow site to meet the needs of the net zero Path to Zero project. So just
That's
an
amazing.
exciting time. Yeah, exciting time.
So it is. I haven't been up to Canada in several years, but I can only imagine that it is really hustling and bustling in that region. Not just because of those direct investments, but of course we also know that I think ACC had published some data a while ago that says something like 7 jobs are created for every job that's created inside the petrochemical industry, right? Whether it be grocery stores and
Yeah.
schools and doctors and nurses and all of that. So that's a huge impact for your region.
Yeah, there's both the direct and the indirect. There's all that stuff. There's the indirect impacts as well, but also the spend that the companies have amongst other companies in supply chain. And I mean, of course, there's the knock-on effects from workers staying in hotels and eating in
Yeah.
restaurants and all that stuff. But even the spend of companies in the industrial heartland, it's a real economic engine for the region, for the province, and for the country.
Yeah. So, what about the Heartland makes it such an attractive place for companies to invest?
Yeah, so I'm really optimistic about the future growth here for the industrial heartland, and there's a few things that have been competitive advantages for decades, of course, and then there's really the growth in the drive for low carbon products and industrial decarbonization that enhances that further. But just to start, the main economic driver in this part of the world is the low cost feedstocks. So low cost methane, propane, ethane, butane, particularly in the petrochemical space, coming out of natural gas liquids. In North America, it's the lowest cost feedstocks in North America. Your discount rate here versus Gulf Coast is typically between 30 to 40%. I mean, that of course ranges day to day, but on average, you're looking 30 to 40% discount for those feedstocks here. And
That's real
largest
money.
when your largest operating cost is your feedstock, having a significant discount for your methane or your propane or whatever you're using as your feedstock,
Yeah.
that's a tremendous competitive advantage. And as you know, those feedstock costs in North America are a lot cheaper than other parts in the world too. There's a few pockets, of course, that still have really strong advantage, but in general, North American feedstock costs are low relative to other jurisdictions, and here in Alberta, we have a discount compared to, say, the Gulf Coast. So there's a tremendous economic advantage, and that's driven investment here for decades. What's really been, I'm going to say, interesting over the last, say, 5 to 7 years, is the interest in producing lower carbon products. And so
Right.
that leads to companies looking at carbon capture and sequestration is one of the technologies that large emitters would look to. And this jurisdiction is world leading when it comes to that. This region has operating carbon sequestration assets in this region, been operating since 2015. There's the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line is a carbon trunk line that leads to additional sequestration capability. That was built with a capacity of 14.6 million tons a year of CO2 carrying capability. It's operating, around 10% full. And
Wow.
so you've got 90% capacity and capability in that asset that companies can take advantage of. That capital is already
Yeah.
invested in the ground, and companies can come and work with the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line to look to sequester. But that's just one
Yeah,
opportunity.
I think that's so significant because of course we know that there's a lot of companies and regions talking about building carbon capture and sequestration, and it's expensive, right? It is an expensive project to build. It is time consuming to build any of that. And so for that to be part of your core infrastructure is
Sure.
a real significant advantage.
Well, it's infrastructure today that's working today. So that's the
Yeah.
other advantage. It's operational today. So it's not like it's something that we're hoping to do or that this region has done that. Companies in this region have built that pipeline. That's an example. But I also want to elaborate on that a little bit. The government of Alberta, 2 to 3 years ago, they allocated pore space and they identified carbon hub operators. They awarded carbon hub operator status. So there's six of them in the region that are now progressing projects for, or at least doing the studies that are necessary and trying to understand if they'll advance their carbon hub operator projects.
Yeah.
One of them is the Atlas project that I mentioned earlier, but there's so there's five others that are under study. So that would give optionality. So you're building a large
Yeah.
emitting petrochemical facility. You have optionality, or you will have optionality as to where you can, how you can manage your emissions. And so carbon management is another key advantage here that I'm going to say that over the last 5 to 7 years is really maybe 10 years on the outset, but has really come to the forefront here as a competitive advantage. So you've got low cost feedstocks, carbon management capability. Then you have great logistics here with respect to proximity or getting to markets. So,
Yeah.
two class one railways service the area, moving products out to the West Coast or the East Coast or down to the Gulf Coast. Good accessibility into the United States markets with the rail networks. And then, of course, we've got 582 square kilometers of flat, pre-zoned heavy industrial land, a skilled workforce here. You come and look at the industrial cluster here. We encourage companies to come and have a look here.
Yeah.
You'll see the cluster and you'll realize that the skilled workforce that's here to operate and build these facilities, it's a bona fide cluster, has skilled workforce to do what needs to be done. And I'm really excited and optimistic about the future here.
I think that's exciting. And I think a few points of that are so critical. So, number one, I think just the natural gas backbone from a feedstock perspective. On a relative basis, it's already a relatively clean feedstock as compared to heavy oils, as compared to coal, which, again, is being utilized as a feedstock for some chemical products elsewhere. So, I think just starting with that and then layering in the carbon capture, layering in the infrastructure and the workforce becomes compelling because, as you know, and we've talked about this before, I've spent some time developing projects back in my corporate days. And, location is always critical, close to the customer, close to the feedstocks, and close to your transportation is critical, but also being in a friendly and well-skilled business environment is really critical.
I just want to add one more thing too, Victoria, we've done some work over the last year. We will be rolling that out probably here in the first quarters. We've done some work benchmarking our industrial cluster here versus some other global industrial clusters because you mentioned, carbon intensity. And so we're doing that from an ESG lens, basically. And so that, the carbon intensity of your feedstocks, your grid, the capability or the diversity of your workforce and skill set and proximity of workforce. Like there's a whole bunch of measures between the environment and social and governance range that we've used to benchmark the industrial heartland versus other jurisdictions. And really for a functioning industrial cluster, it's world leading from that standpoint. So for companies globally where that matters, this will be a jurisdiction for them.
Yeah. We're in a changing world, right? In a lot of ways, when I think about just the global economics and the geopolitical climate, the U.S. has just inaugurated a new president. Canada is poised for another federal election. There's just a lot going on. How does this influence investment in Alberta? How are you managing and navigating some of those changes?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I mean, you'll hear often, and when you're talking with business leaders and others, like, uncertainty is always a headwind for investment. And you can understand why. I mean, when you're investing other people's money and lots of it, hundreds of millions or billions of dollars, boards of directors and executives there'll be a tendency to wait and see if the uncertainty is going to become more certain before you can make a decision. And so typically uncertainty leads to a bit of a pause in capital investment. And so there's not much we can do about the uncertainty, but what we can do, there's a few things that we focus on. So, of course, we have an advocacy component that we work with like-minded stakeholders on, where we're advocating for specific policies. Over the years, we've been fortunate that there's been good traction in a lot of things that have improved competitiveness and improved the regulatory streamlining here in Alberta. So, we put in our best efforts to work with like-minded partners and governments to try to improve the region from a number of fronts that hopefully, improves the certainty for companies that are looking to invest. So that's one. We also help companies navigate the system here, the regulatory framework, or put them in touch with the right people in the government to navigate so that they can understand the complexities of the system a little bit better. The actual uncertainty itself, though, it's at very top levels of governments. That's, it'll be what it'll be. And I think companies will figure it out. It's a bit of a wait and see, I think, at the moment, and we'll figure out what the world's going to look like from a policy standpoint and make the appropriate decisions from there.
Yeah, makes sense. And I know we've also seen a few supply chain challenges recently. In fact, the U.S., so somehow all of our ports have decided that this was the year to strike. We saw it in Canada. We saw it in the U.S. How do you see that playing out going forward? And did you have any role in, or were you also watching on the sidelines like the rest of us?
Well, again, the message around stable, certain logistics supply chains is so important for Alberta here in particular, being landlocked. It's so important for us to be able to move products, and not only just being landlocked, but also the majority of the products produced in this region are exported. So we need access to export markets, and so that uncertainty again is a significant headwind for investment, especially from international investors. So just being a voice there, of course, is what is the best that we can do, and trying to really raise awareness that, look, from an international standpoint, any hiccup or interruption to logistics supply chains and logistics to getting products to international markets, that would cause international investors in their overall assessment, that would probably be a strike against this region from an overall investment.
But it's also temporary, right? Those things have gotten resolved. Those are temporary, I guess, blips in the system. And in fact, I spoke with Kevin Ittrey, who's an investment banker, a few weeks ago on the Chemical Show. And he really talked about the U.S. being a very attractive market for Asian investors because they're looking for secure and growing markets. I would assume the same is true in Canada. Are you seeing the same interest in international investment?
So for our region, absolutely. There's a lot of interest from Asian companies, primarily looking to invest in projects that would export the products to their markets. I mean, there are some companies that are looking, they want to access North American markets and build a facility here and get a foothold into the North American markets. That there's some interest there too. But I'd say a lot of our interest from Asian customers or Asian clients, companies that are looking to build projects or look at petrochemical projects. I'd say the largest interest is building a facility in the industrial heartland and then accessing that product, moving that product into Asia from here. Now, proximity and the connectivity from here is really attractive, more so than I'd say from the Gulf Coast in the U.S., because getting our product to the West Coast, Port of Prince Rupert, for example, that shipping time from the Port of Prince Rupert into, let's say, Japan, for example, that shipping time is about half than if you came out of the Gulf Coast, had to go through Canal and then over. So we've got really good proximity to Asian markets from West Coast, British Columbia, the West Coast of Canada. And we've got good rail connectivity to the West Coast. So we do have a lot of Asian companies, a lot of interest in looking at building facilities in the industrial heartland, moving product to meet the growing needs in Asian markets.
Yeah, makes sense. And again, as we talked about with the infrastructure, feedstock costs, skilled workforce, it becomes really cost effective as well to build and export.
Well, definitely. I mean, clustering has advantages. There's a skill set here. Some outputs from one become inputs to another. So when you have a bona fide cluster like you have in the industrial heartland and you have the connectivity like we have here, I think gives a lot of confidence to foreign investors when they're looking to invest. They can see, okay, this is a functioning cluster. World-class companies operate here. There's something going on here that we need to understand better.
So I know that you are gearing up for the Canadian Petrochemical Summit in June. And this is, I guess, the second time you guys have hosted this event, and it's really an opportunity to showcase the heartland and what it can do. So can you tell us just a little bit more about that event?
Absolutely. So I believe it's our third time, to be honest.
Okay, third. Yeah.
May even be fourth, but I have to apologize.
All right, so I haven't been counting. It's okay. Anyways, we'll fix it.
Anyways, it's a very focused Canadian Petrochemical Summit, but it's really small group intended to really have the decision makers and key participants in the petrochemical sector, so that it'll be high value for them to be in such an intimate setting, having discussions around the petrochemical industry, issues of the day, potential opportunities to work together, et cetera. So this year it's June 17th to 19th, and it'll be in Lake Louise. It's the first time we're doing it out at Lake Louise,
nice.
But it's in the mountains. So think about the setting, right? You've got
Yeah.
a fairly small focused group in the mountains. You're there for 2 to 3 days. You're not going anywhere from there. You're doing some wonderful things out in the mountains. You're enjoying maybe some golf or hiking, etc. before the conference happens. But it's not like at the end of the afternoon you're going for dinner somewhere else. And no, you're there at Lake Louise. It's very focused. It's a great networking opportunity, really focused on having decision makers and participants in the petrochemical sector there. So that's what this event is all about, and it's in Lake Louise in the middle of June, June 17th and 19th.
I like that. Well, and it's I've got my own conference that I run in the fall, the Chemical Summit, but different focus. But yet I also recognize the uniqueness of having a small event focused just on leaders and building those relationships, having the right conversations is so critical because it doesn't necessarily happen a lot in our industry. A lot of the events are big dine and dash meet and greets where you're running all day long. And so having the opportunity to spend time together and connect and reflect and grow is really critical.
Yeah, both styles have a role for sure. We just
Yeah.
find that this focused event, specifically on petrochemicals, we think that's adding value. In the end, like we're not in the conference business. Like that's not a
No,
business. We're in the
no.
business of facilitating project development and helping
Yeah.
companies advance projects. And
Yeah.
so we just want to, the end result is that, right? We want companies to be able to connect and advance conversations and ideas. And so having a focused conference, we think helps with that.
And I know that the theme this year is navigating global markets. What can you tell us about the theme and some of the speakers or topics that people will expect?
Navigating global markets really just highlights that, the petrochemical sector here, it is a global conversation, particularly with what we just talked about with some of the geopolitics. So, the types of themes that we talk about and speakers we get in, we'll get experts. We usually start off with, global market trends in the petrochemical sector and then drill down into, specific feedstock outlooks in Western Canada and North America. And then there's conversations around supply chain. We talked about some of the supply chain challenges. It's always useful to have a conversation on geopolitics and world politics and get experts in on that and that as well. I think that's interesting for some of the leaders in the room to
Absolutely.
listen to. So historically, we've had really good feedback. It's very valuable couple of days. And
Good.
so,
I love it.
CanadianPetrochemicalSummit.com or Canadian Petrochemical Summit.com to get more information.
Okay, awesome. We'll include a link so that people can find it as well. So, final question for you, Mark. You have worked with a lot of global leaders, both in the public sector, in the private sector. What characteristics really stand out about a great leader?
I mean, business schools look at leadership all the time, and there's courses on leadership. And, at least in my experience, and first of all, let's talk from personal experience, and then
Yeah,
from what I've seen, that leadership position, of course, the first and foremost thing is you need to actually take a leadership position. Because in the absence of taking a leadership position, there's a void. And then people fill that void with their own narratives. So,
yeah,
so before you say whether they're a great leader, just to be a leader, it sounds trivial and maybe a little bit trite, but taking that leadership position where you're out front saying, this is how I think we need to go and get people to rally behind you. Taking that leadership position is first and foremost. Whether you're a great leader or not, the difference is between what that leadership position is. Are you doing it with integrity and conviction and driving that forward? So I guess from what I've seen, when I look at people that I've worked for who I think have been great leaders and who
yeah,
I've met have been great leaders, is you're driving that leadership position, but you're doing so with integrity and conviction. You're convincing people that you're coming from the right place, and then you have the
yeah,
conviction to say that this is the way forward. And those two things, coupled with that, just stepping out front and being a leader is really important. I know it's a bit of a circular conversation because in order to be a leader, you got to take a leadership position, of course. But you've seen in politics in some cases where if you have a void, like if you don't have your leader coming forward and saying this,
yeah,
then there's a void and others fill it.
yeah. I
Not
mean,
just
and
politics,
this
in
whole thing
business as
around
well.
owning your space.
Yeah.
You got to own your space.
In business as well. You're in a
Yeah,
dynamic world. In my view, anyway, your leader needs to be communicating up front that this is the position, you've got integrity and conviction, and then your workers and your company and everyone will see that, and I'm going to follow this because it's coming from the right place, it's got conviction, and that's at least off the top of my head what I've seen. I know that when I was initially put into leadership roles,
yeah,
I remember that being sort of the initial stress was something's happened and you need to be taking a leadership position up front And that's the step you need to take. That was the first real big learning for me when I was put in my first leadership position. It's like, wait a second, okay, this is on me. I can't wait for someone else. I've got to be out front taking that position. And sure, you're in conversation with the people that you work with, but you've got to be the one up front taking that position and with integrity and conviction. That's off the top of my head, Victoria. I don't know.
That's good. I really love that, though, and I think I think it's great. And I think, first of all, the integrity and conviction are really critical. But to your point, that making that switch into a leadership position, I used to sometimes tell people, I'm like, it's now your turn to define the work and the path. Like, we go along in our careers so long as being worker bees, if you will,
Yes,
right?
exactly.
Like letting somebody else lead and set direction. And that first flip into a leadership role, when it's like, oh no, I'm setting the direction, is so critical.
Exactly.
People expect it of you, and that's also how you define yourself.
So it's really interesting because until you're put in that position, or at least for me, until I was put in that position, you don't really think of it that way until you're in it. So for me in my career, I sort of had a pretty big jump into a leadership role in a foreign jurisdiction. So I'm now leading a foreign operation, and everyone's looking to you.
Yeah.
And you need to be upfront taking that position. I remember that specifically. It was like, okay, everyone's looking to me to set direction, and you got to step up and do it. And so, great leaders for me you're not leaving a void. You're taking a leadership position with integrity and conviction to drive things.
I love it. I think it makes a lot of sense, and I know that's what you do every day at the Heartland.
Well, hopefully my team thinks so.
I'm sure they do. I'll ask them afterwards.
Yes, exactly.
Well, Mark, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for joining me on The Chemical Show.
Victoria, thanks for having me again, and I really appreciate the conversation.
Absolutely. And thank you, everybody, for listening. Keep listening, keep following, keep sharing, and we will talk again soon. Thanks for joining us today on The Chemical Show. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and most importantly, share it with your friends and colleagues. For more insights, visit thechemicalshow.com and connect with us on LinkedIn. You can find me at Victoria King Meyer on LinkedIn, and you can also find us at The Chemical Show Podcast. Join us next time for more conversations and strategies shaping the future of the industry. We'll see you soon.